I met Brian Anderson on a rooftop pool in Bangkok 3 years ago, during what should have been his celebration of freedom. Instead, I watched a 53-year-old man stare at his phone with the hollow eyes of someone who'd seen his entire life collapse in a 7-second video clip. What happened to Brian wasn't unique. Thousands of men fall into the same trap every year. But Brian's story haunts me because I watched it unfold in real time, powerless to stop a disaster orchestrated by someone he'd never actually met. This is the story of how a lonely Canadian accountant lost everything to a woman who didn't exist, and how intimacy became the weapon that destroyed him. Before we go further, subscribe right now if you've ever wondered how intelligent people fall into traps they should see coming. Because Brian Anderson had a master's degree in finance, 30 years of analyzing risk, and he still couldn't see the hook sinking into him. And what you're about to discover will reveal exactly why that confidence meant nothing. Brian Anderson's marriage ended on a Tuesday in February, 20 months before I met him in Bangkok. His wife of 26 years announced over breakfast that she'd been having an affair with their dentist for 3 years. By Friday, Brian was signing divorce papers in a lawyer's office that smelled like old coffee and broken promises. By March, he was living alone in a downtown Toronto condo that echoed with silence. The loneliness hit him hardest at night. He'd built his entire adult life around Karen, their routines, their friends, their plans for retirement. Now those friends belonged to her, choosing sides the way divorcing couples' social circles always do. At 53, Brian discovered he didn't know how to be alone. He didn't know how to cook for one person. He didn't know how to fill the hours between leaving work and going to bed. His daughter Emily suggested therapy. His brother suggested dating apps. Brian tried both, with the enthusiasm of a man treading water, waiting for something to change. The dating apps terrified him. Toronto's dating scene for middle-aged men felt like a brutal marketplace, where he was permanently discounted merchandise. Women his age seemed to be looking for men 10 years younger. Younger women weren't looking at all. After 3 months of stilted coffee dates and conversations that died in awkward silence, Brian deleted every app from his phone. That's when he discovered the chat platforms. It started innocently enough. International chat rooms where people practiced English, discussed travel, shared photos of their cities. Brian joined a group called Southeast Asia Explorers because he'd always wanted to visit Thailand. The people there were friendly, curious about Canada, eager to exchange stories. For the first time in months, Brian felt like someone actually wanted to talk to him. Sassy Torn messaged him privately on a Saturday night in October. Her profile photo showed a beautiful woman in her early 30s, dark hair falling past her shoulders, standing in front of a Bangkok temple. Her opening message was simple. "I saw you're from Toronto. My cousin lives there. Tell me about Canadian winters." They talked for 4 hours that first night. Sassitorn, she asked him to call her Sassy, worked as a translator for a Bangkok hotel. She was divorced, no children, living with her elderly mother in a modest apartment near the city center. She described her life with vivid detail. The morning market where she bought fresh mangoes, the rooftop where she practiced yoga at sunset, the stray dogs she fed near her building. Brian found himself logging in every evening, waiting for her messages. Their conversations shifted from polite small talk to something deeper. She asked about his divorce with genuine empathy, sharing her own story of a husband who'd gambled away their savings. She laughed at his jokes about Canadian politeness. She sent him photos of Bangkok street food and asked his opinion on whether she should cut her hair. 3 weeks into their daily conversations, Sassy suggested they switch to video chat. "I want to see your face when you laugh," she wrote. "Text doesn't capture your personality." The first video call lasted 6 hours. Brian set up his laptop in his living room, suddenly self-conscious about the generic furniture and bare walls. When Sasi's face appeared on screen, he felt his breath catch. She was even more beautiful than her photos suggested, animated and warm, her eyes crinkling when she smiled. They talked about everything: his work as an accountant, her dreams of opening a small cafe, their favorite movies, the books that had shaped them. Sasi asked him what he missed most about being married, and Brian surprised himself by crying as he answered. She didn't look away or change the subject. She just listened, nodding, her face soft with understanding. "You deserve better than what happened to you," she said quietly. "You deserve someone who sees how special you are." That night something shifted between them. What had been friendly conversation became something else, something that felt like possibility, like hope, like the first warm day after a brutal winter. Over the next month, their video calls became the center of Brian's life. He'd rush home from work, order takeout, and spend his evenings talking to Sasi through the screen. She'd show him her neighborhood, carrying her laptop through Bangkok streets, introducing him to the vendors who sold her fruit, the cats that lived in the alley behind her building. He'd show her Toronto's skyline from his balcony, the coffee shop where he bought his morning latte, the park where he walked on weekends. Their conversations grew more intimate. They talked about past relationships, about vulnerability, about what they wanted from life. Sasi confessed she'd never felt this connected to someone. Brian admitted he was falling for her, terrified by how much he cared about someone he'd never touched. "Distance doesn't matter," Sasi told him one night, her face serious on the screen. "What we have is real. I feel it. Don't you?" Brian did feel it. For the first time since his divorce, he felt alive. One evening in late November, their conversation took a different turn. They had been talking for 3 hours, comfortable silence settling between them as they each read in their separate countries. Sasi looked up from her book, studying him through the camera. "I wish you were here," she said softly. "I wish I could touch you." The air between them changed. Brian felt his pulse quicken. "I wish that too," he managed. "Show me you trust me," Sasi whispered. "Show me this is real, for you too." What happened next would become the footage that destroyed Brian's life. But in that moment, wrapped in loneliness and desperate need for connection, he saw only a beautiful woman who made him feel wanted again. He didn't see the trap closing around him. He didn't notice the subtle shift in her expression when he agreed. He didn't question why she suggested they both turn off the lights, creating shadows that would make everything feel more intimate, more secret, more his. The boundary between longing and surrender dissolved that night. Brian crossed lines he'd never imagined crossing, driven by a hunger to feel desired, to feel human, to feel anything other than the crushing isolation that had defined his months alone. Afterward, lying in his darkened bedroom, his laptop still glowing beside him, Brian felt a strange mix of exhilaration and shame. Sasi's voice was tender, as she told him she'd never felt so close to anyone. She made him promise they'd do this again. She made him feel like what they'd shared was beautiful, not desperate. He fell asleep, smiling, unaware that in a nondescript apartment in Manila, not Bangkok, 4 people were reviewing the footage, marking timestamps, cropping his face into perfect clarity, preparing the trap that would spring in exactly 7 days. Stop. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will shatter every assumption you have about online romance. Write in the comments, have you ever trusted someone you'd never met in person? Because Brian's answer to that question cost him everything. The week after that night passed in a blur of video calls and messages that felt increasingly like love. Sasi sent him photos constantly, her morning coffee, a sunset from her rooftop, a smile before bed. She talked about visiting Toronto in the spring, meeting his daughter, walking through the city together. Brian researched flights to Bangkok, imagining their first real embrace. On the 8th day, a message arrived from an account he didn't recognize. No text, just a video file. Brian opened it, assuming it was spam. The preview image made his blood turn to ice. The footage was professionally edited, crystal clear, showing everything from that night in devastating detail. His face was perfectly visible, identifiable, unmistakable. The camera angles proved this wasn't accidental. Someone had recorded deliberately, cutting between his expressions and his actions with the precision of someone who'd done this many times before. The message that followed came from a different account, the language cold and efficient. We have 57 contacts from your Facebook friend list. Family members, work colleagues, your daughter, Emily. In 72 hours, every person you know will receive this video, unless you transfer $50,000 USD to the following account. Instructions below. Do not contact police. We have friends in Toronto who will know immediately. The price doubles if you wait more than 72 hours. Pay, and this ends forever. Brian's hands shook so violently he dropped his phone. He retrieved it from the floor, reading the message again, certain he'd misunderstood. This couldn't be real. This had to be some horrible joke, some technical error, something explainable. He called Sasi immediately. Her phone went to voicemail. He tried video chat, offline. He sent desperate messages that showed as delivered but never read. Panic clawed at his throat. He paced his apartment, mind racing through impossible scenarios. Could he pay? $50,000 would devastate his savings, money he'd planned to use to rebuild his life after the divorce. But the alternative? His daughter seeing that video, his co-workers, his elderly mother, was unthinkable. He tried to think like the financial analyst he was, looking for logical solutions. But this wasn't a spreadsheet problem. This was his life, his reputation, his relationship with his daughter, all balanced on a knife's edge. At 2 a.m, unable to sleep, unable to think, Brian made the first transfer. $25,000 to an account in the Philippines. He included a desperate message. This is half. I need 3 days to access the rest. Please don't send the video. I'm begging you. The response came within minutes. 48 hours for the remaining amount. After that, everyone sees who you really are. For 2 days, Brian existed in a fog of terror. He called in sick to work. He ignored calls from his daughter. He sat in his darkened apartment, staring at his phone, waiting for the next message, the next demand, the confirmation that this nightmare would end if he just paid enough. On the 3rd day, he transferred the remaining $25,000. The confirmation message felt like a pardon. Received. All footage deleted. You will never hear from us again. Goodbye. Brian collapsed on his couch, sobbing with relief. It was over. He'd paid the price, learned his lesson, survived his stupidity. He'd be more careful from now on. He'd never speak of this again. He'd rebuild his savings and forget this ever happened. That relief lasted exactly 4 days. The next message arrived on a Sunday afternoon. We need more. 30,000 this time. You have 1 week. Same rules apply. Brian's relief shattered into something darker. Rage mixed with desperate fear. He'd paid. They'd promised. This was supposed to be over. He tried to negotiate, explaining he had no more money. They sent him screenshots of his LinkedIn profile, photos of his condo building, his daughter's Facebook page. Find the money. We know you can. Your daughter is very pretty. Would be a shame if her friends saw her father's video. The second payment took Brian 10 days to arrange. He borrowed against his retirement fund, took a personal loan from his credit union, sold his car. $30,000 disappeared into another anonymous account, leaving Brian financially crippled and emotionally destroyed. This time there was no message confirming the footage was deleted. No reassurance, just silence. 3 weeks later, they demanded $40,000 more. Brian finally understood. This would never end. They would bleed him until nothing remained. Then they'd send the video anyway, because mercy wasn't part of their business model. He sat in his apartment, staring at the demand, and made a different decision. He called the police. The detective assigned to Brian's case was a woman named Sarah Chen, who'd worked financial crimes for 12 years. She listened to his story without judgment, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. Her expression neutral, but not unkind. "You're the 4th person this month with this exact story," she told him when he finished. "Same pattern, same threats, probably same organization. They're based in the Philippines, operating what's called a sextortion ring. You're not alone in this." The word sextortion made Brian flinch. It sounded clinical, official, like a diagnosis of a disease he'd caught through his own stupidity. Detective Chen explained the reality. The organization behind this was sophisticated, operating across multiple countries, using virtual private networks and cryptocurrency to hide their tracks. The Sassitorn Brian had fallen for was likely multiple people. Writers crafting messages, someone else appearing on video, technicians managing the recording software. "The person you talked to probably wasn't even in Thailand," Chen said. "These operations use stock photos, fake locations, scripted conversations. They're remarkably good at what they do." She explained that recovering his money was nearly impossible. The funds had been transferred through multiple accounts in different countries within hours of payment, converted to cryptocurrency, and vanished into the digital ether. The chances of finding the actual people behind the operation were slim. They were likely sitting in call centers in Manila or Cebu, running dozens of these scams simultaneously, protected by local corruption and international legal complexity. "What we can do is add your case to the international database," Chen continued. "If enough victims come forward, we can work with Interpol, potentially shut down some of these operations. But I need to be honest with you. Your money is gone. The video they threatened you with might still exist somewhere on a server you'll never find." Brian felt his last hope crumble. "So, I paid $75,000 for nothing." "You paid for what you thought would protect you," Chen said gently. "That's what they count on. Fear is more effective than greed in these operations." She asked if he'd be willing to share his story publicly, to warn others. Brian imagined standing in front of cameras, admitting what he'd done, becoming the cautionary tale other men would judge while thinking they'd never be so stupid. "I can't," he whispered. "My daughter." "Your daughter loves you," Chen interrupted. "And she'd rather hear this from you than discover it by accident. These people might still send that video, Brian. You need to prepare for that possibility." The conversation Brian had with Emily 3 days later was the hardest of his life. They met at a coffee shop near her university, and he told her everything. The loneliness, Sassy, the video, the money, the threats that still hung over him like a sword. Emily listened without interrupting, her face cycling through shock and anger and something that looked like grief. When he finished, she reached across the table and took his hand. "Dad, I'm so sorry this happened to you," she said, her voice breaking. "Those people are monsters. You were just lonely. You didn't deserve this." Brian had expected judgment. Emily's compassion unraveled him completely. He cried in that coffee shop, surrounded by students studying for exams, while his daughter held his hand and promised him they'd get through this together. But getting through it proved harder than either of them anticipated. Pause this video and subscribe immediately, because what I'm about to reveal will fundamentally change how you think about online privacy and manipulation. The next revelation will make your blood run cold. Comment below what you think Brian should have done differently, because hindsight doesn't help victims like him. The video never went public, but the threat of it became Brian's constant shadow. He'd wake at 3 in the morning, heart pounding, checking his email for messages from unknown senders. He'd scan his daughter's face for signs she'd seen something, heard something from her friends. He'd feel his chest tighten every time his phone buzzed with notifications. His work performance deteriorated. He made errors in spreadsheets that he'd once complete flawlessly, missed deadlines, withdrew from colleagues. His supervisor suggested he take medical leave. Brian accepted, grateful for the escape but terrified by the implication that others could see his breakdown. He started seeing a therapist named Dr. Patel, who specialized in trauma recovery. In their 3rd session, Dr. Patel asked him what hurt most about the experience. "The stupidity," Brian answered immediately. "How could I be so stupid?" "Loneliness isn't stupidity," Dr. Patel replied. "These organizations are sophisticated psychological operations. They study human vulnerability the way scientists study disease. They know exactly which buttons to push, which words create connection, which timing breaks down defenses. You weren't stupid. You were human." But Brian couldn't shake the shame. He'd given money to criminals. He'd trusted someone who didn't exist. He'd exposed himself to strangers who'd weaponized that exposure. Every part of the experience felt like a referendum on his judgment, his character, his worth as a person. Dr. Patel introduced him to a support group for victims of online romance scams. Brian resisted initially. The idea of sitting in a circle with strangers, sharing his humiliation, felt unbearable. But his isolation was killing him slowly, and he was desperate enough to try anything. The group met in a church basement on Thursday evenings. 12 people sat in a circle, 8 men, 4 women, ages ranging from 28 to 71. Each had a story that echoed Brian's with terrifying similarity. There was Margaret, 63, who'd sent $80,000 to a businessman in London who needed help with a temporary cash flow problem. There was James, 45, whose girlfriend in Ukraine had needed money for her sick mother, then for travel documents, then for legal fees that never resulted in her arrival. There was David, 57, whose story mirrored Brian's so precisely it felt like looking into a dark mirror. David had also been blackmailed with intimate footage, had also paid, had also discovered the payments would never end. The difference? David had received a message 6 months after his last payment, informing him his video had been uploaded to a pornographic website with his full name attached. He'd spent $15,000 hiring a company to scrub the footage from the internet, playing endless whack-a-mole with mirror sites and downloads. "The video's still out there somewhere," David told the group, his voice flat with resignation. "I've accepted I'll never get it completely removed. People I know have probably seen it. I just don't acknowledge it anymore. What else can I do?" Listening to these stories, Brian realized something profound. He wasn't uniquely stupid or uniquely vulnerable. He was one of thousands of people who'd been hunted by predators who understood human psychology better than most therapists. These weren't random crimes of opportunity. They were calculated operations with training manuals, quotas, and bonuses for operators who extracted the most money from their victims. The group facilitator, a woman named Rita who'd lost her life savings to a romance scammer, shared statistics that made Brian's stomach turn. Romance and sextortion scams had increased by 67% in the past 3 years. The FBI estimated Americans alone lost over $1 billion to these operations annually. The majority of victims never reported their experiences due to shame. "Shame is their greatest weapon," Rita said. "As long as victims stay silent, they keep operating with impunity." Brian left that first group meeting feeling something unexpected. Anger. Not at himself, but at the system that had destroyed him. At the organizations running these operations, at the countries that harbored them, at the internet platforms that made it so easy to create fake identities and hunt vulnerable people. That anger became fuel. Brian spent the next 3 months researching everything he could find about sextortion and romance scam operations. He joined online forums where victims shared their stories anonymously. He read academic papers about psychological manipulation and parasocial relationships. He contacted journalists who'd written about these crimes, offering his story if they'd promised to focus on the organizations rather than mocking victims. One journalist, a woman named Patricia Morrison, who wrote for a major Canadian newspaper, took him up on the offer. Her article, published in March, told Brian's story, with his real name attached, alongside stories from 5 other victims. The piece went viral, generating thousands of comments and shares. The comment section was brutal. Half the responses expressed sympathy and shared similar experiences. The other half mocked Brian and the other victims as pathetic, desperate, deserving their fate. "How stupid do you have to be," one commenter wrote, "to fall for an obvious scam?" Brian forced himself to read every comment, absorbing the judgment, using it to fuel his next decision. He contacted Detective Chen and asked to be connected with international agencies investigating these operations. She introduced him to an agent with Interpol's Financial Crimes Division, who was coordinating with law enforcement in the Philippines. "We're building a case," the agent told Brian during a video call, "but we need more victims willing to testify. Most people pay and disappear. We can't prosecute without evidence and cooperation." Brian became that cooperation. He provided every message, every transaction record, every piece of evidence from his experience. He connected with other victims through online forums, encouraging them to come forward, offering to be the public face if they wanted to remain anonymous. Slowly, a network emerged. Victims in Canada, America, Australia, Britain, and across Europe, all sharing eerily similar stories. all hunted by what appeared to be the same interconnected organizations. The patterns were identical. Fake profiles, weeks of conversation building trust, intimate video calls recorded without consent, escalating blackmail demands, threats involving family and employers. The investigation moved glacially. International cooperation was complicated by jurisdictional disputes, corruption, and the difficulty of tracking criminals who operated entirely online, using false identities and encrypted communications. But 9 months after Brian first filed his police report, authorities in Manila raided an office building in the Makati district. They arrested 23 people operating a call center that ran romance and sextortion scams, targeting victims in North America and Europe. Detective Chen called Brian with the news. They had files on thousands of victims, she told him. Your case was one of dozens they were actively working. We're still processing the evidence, but this is a significant bust. Brian felt a strange emptiness at the news. The people arrested weren't the faces he'd seen on his screen. Sassitorn hadn't been in that building. The masterminds behind the operation had likely fled long before the raid. Warned by connections within the Philippine legal system, his money was still gone. The video still existed somewhere in digital archives he'd never access. The damage to his psyche remained, manifesting in anxiety attacks when his phone buzzed, in his inability to trust anyone who showed interest in him online, in the nightmares, where he watched his life explode on an endless loop. But something had shifted. Brian was no longer just a victim. He was a voice, a warning, a small but persistent force pushing back against an industry built on shame and silence. Subscribe to this channel before we continue, because what I'm about to reveal about Brian's final decision will challenge everything you think you know about recovery from trauma. Your comment might help someone trapped in a similar nightmare right now. Write below if you've ever encountered a scam like this, even if you didn't fall for it. I met Brian on that Bangkok rooftop pool 1 year after the raid in Manila. He was in Thailand for a victims advocacy conference organized by an international NGO fighting online exploitation. Despite everything, Thailand, or what he'd thought was Thailand, represented in his trauma. He'd chosen to face his fears by actually visiting the country he'd once dreamed about, with someone who never existed. We'd been connected through mutual contacts in the victim advocacy community. I'd written about sextortion scams for several publications, and Brian had agreed to meet with me to discuss his ongoing recovery. He looked older than 54, his face carrying lines that hadn't been there in photos from before his ordeal. But there was something in his eyes that surprised me. Not brokenness, but a kind of fierce clarity that comes from surviving something that should have destroyed you. I thought about ending my life, he told me, staring out at Bangkok's skyline as the sun set over the city. 3 times I sat in my apartment with a bottle of pills, absolutely convinced the world would be better without the pathetic person I'd become. The only thing that stopped me was imagining Emily finding my body and wondering if my suicide was somehow her fault for not protecting me enough. He paused, taking a long drink of water. That's when I realized the scammers had already stolen $75,000 from me. I wasn't going to let them steal my life too. Brian's recovery had been neither linear nor complete. He still saw Dr. Patel weekly. He still had panic attacks triggered by unexpected messages or video calls. He'd quit his accounting job and now worked remotely as a consultant, unable to face daily interaction with colleagues who might have seen the article about him. But he'd also become one of the most effective advocates in the fight against sextortion. He spoke at conferences, worked with law enforcement agencies, counseled other victims through their darkest moments. He'd helped develop educational materials used by schools and senior centers to warn about romance scams. The hardest part, he said, watching tourists take selfies by the pool, is accepting that I was the perfect victim. Lonely, recently divorced, financially stable, desperate for connection. I check every box on their target list. And the worst part? Knowing that if I'd met Sassy a year from now instead of when I did, I'd probably fall for it again. Because the loneliness doesn't just disappear. The hunger for connection doesn't just switch off. I asked him if he'd tried dating again. He laughed, a sound tinged with sadness. How? How do I trust anyone when I know how easy it is to create a convincing lie? I look at dating profiles and I see potential scammers. I meet someone nice at the grocery store and wonder what they're really after. The scam didn't just steal my money. It stole my ability to trust my own judgment. That, he explained, was the most insidious damage these operations inflicted. They didn't just extract money. They shattered victims' fundamental trust in human connection. They weaponized intimacy, turning the basic human need for love and acceptance into a trap. I talked to victims who lost more money than I did, Brian continued. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. Life savings, their children's college funds. And you know what they all say? I can accept losing the money. What I can't accept is that what I felt wasn't real. That's the real theft. Not the dollars, the belief that someone actually cared. As the sun finally set and Bangkok's lights began to sparkle across the city, Brian shared one more story. One he hadn't told the journalists or the support groups. 6 months after the Manila raid, he'd received an email from an anonymous account. No threats, no demands. Just a message. Mr. Anderson, I was one of the team members who worked your case. I'm so sorry for what we did. I needed money for my sick child, and this was the only job I could find that paid enough. I told myself you were rich, that you could afford to lose the money, that you were just another foreigner looking for cheap thrills. I was wrong. After the raid, I found better work. I'm trying to be a better person. I know you'll never forgive me, but I needed you to know that I'm sorry. Your kindness in those early messages made my job harder than usual. You seemed like a good person. I hope you can rebuild your life. I hope you can forgive yourself for being human. Brian had never responded to that message. He'd shown it to Dr. Patel, who'd helped him process the complicated emotions it triggered: rage, grief, and something uncomfortably close to understanding. I wanted to hate them, Brian said. I wanted them to be monsters so I could compartmentalize what happened. But they're just people. Desperate people who made terrible choices that destroyed other desperate people. It doesn't excuse anything, but it makes the anger more complicated. We sat in silence for a while, watching people laugh and take photos, living their normal lives, unaware of the darkness that existed in the spaces between connection and deception. Finally, I asked Brian what he'd want people to know. People who might be vulnerable to the same trap he'd fallen into. He thought for a long moment before answering. I'd tell them that loneliness makes you stupid.
Not because you're actually stupid,
but because your brain is literally starving for connection, and a starving brain makes poor decisions. When someone offers you exactly what you're desperate for, your critical thinking shuts down. You stop asking questions. You ignore red flags. You convince yourself that this time, finally, someone actually sees you. He looked directly at me, his eyes intense. I'd tell them to pay attention to the timing. These scammers are patient. They wait until you're completely hooked before they ask for anything. They make you feel special for weeks or months first. They study you, learn your vulnerabilities, figure out exactly what you need to hear. And when they finally spring the trap, you're so emotionally invested that you'll do anything to protect what you think you have. And if someone's already fallen into the trap? I asked. Tell someone immediately, Brian said without hesitation. The shame will tell you to hide it, to handle it alone, to pay and make it go away. Don't listen. Tell a friend, tell family, call the police. The scammers count on your silence. The moment you speak up, their power starts to crack. He pulled out his phone and showed me messages from victims he was currently counseling through various stages of sextortion ordeals. Dozens of conversations. People from around the world, all trapped in variations of the same nightmare he'd survived. This is my life now, he said, helping people through the worst moments of their lives, reliving my own trauma over and over. But knowing that maybe my experience can prevent someone else from making that final payment, or that permanent decision to end their life. I asked if it was worth it, carrying this weight, making his private hell public, dedicating his life to fighting a problem that seemed impossible to solve. Someone has to, he said simply. And I'm already destroyed. Might as well make the destruction mean something. Brian Anderson never fully recovered from what happened to him. 3 years later, he still struggles with anxiety and depression. He still lives alone, unable to trust enough to open himself to real connection. The $75,000 is gone forever, along with the retirement timeline he'd carefully planned. But he's also helped over 200 victims navigate their own sextortion nightmares. He's worked with legislators to strengthen laws around online sexual exploitation. He's trained law enforcement agencies in victim-sensitive interview techniques. He's saved lives, including his own. The organization that targeted him is still operating under different names, different locations, hunting new victims with the same sophisticated psychological playbook. The faces change, the platforms evolve, but the fundamental trap remains. Find someone lonely, offer them connection, record their vulnerability, and extract everything you can before they realize they've been talking to ghosts. Detective Chen told me the sextortion industry has only grown since Brian's case. The pandemic forced millions of people into isolation, creating a massive pool of potential victims hungry for connection. The scammers adapted, improving their techniques, targeting younger demographics, using artificial intelligence to generate more convincing fake profiles. For every operation we shut down, Chen said, 3 more spring up. It's Hydra. We're fighting mythology with paperwork. But Brian remains determined. When I last spoke with him, he was working on a documentary about sextortion, interviewing victims and law enforcement across multiple countries, trying to create something that might actually change how society views these crimes. People need to understand this isn't about sex, he told me. It's about power and money and exploitation. The sexual element is just the hook. What they're really doing is psychological warfare, targeting people's deepest vulnerabilities and using those vulnerabilities as weapons. He paused, then added, "And they're winning. They're winning because we're too ashamed to talk about it, too afraid to admit we're lonely, too embarrassed to acknowledge we needed connection so badly we ignored every warning sign. Until we can talk openly about loneliness, about vulnerability, about the basic human need to be seen and wanted, until we can have those conversations without judgment, these operations will keep destroying lives." I think about Brian often, especially when I hear news of another sextortion victim who chose suicide over exposure, another elderly person who lost their retirement savings to a romance scammer, another young person blackmailed with intimate images they shared with someone they trusted. The lesson of Brian's story isn't about avoiding online relationships or distrusting everyone you meet. It's about recognizing that sophisticated criminals have industrialized loneliness, turned vulnerability into profit, and weaponized the very human need for connection. It's about understanding that falling for these scams doesn't make you stupid. It makes you human. And humans need connection like they need food and water. When we're starving for it, we'll accept whatever's offered, ignore the warning signs, and convince ourselves that this time it's real. If you're reading this and thinking you'd never fall for something so obvious, you're exactly the person these scammers target. Because confidence in your own judgment is a vulnerability they know how to exploit. If you're reading this and you're currently trapped in a sextortion nightmare, know this: you're not alone. Thousands of people are experiencing exactly what you're experiencing right now. The shame is not yours. It belongs to the people manipulating you. Tell someone. Report it. Refuse to pay. The video might get released anyway, but your silence and continued payments guarantee nothing except prolonged suffering. And if you're reading this because you're lonely, searching for connection in digital spaces where identities can be constructed and intentions hidden, be careful. Not because everyone online is a scammer, but because the scammers have become so good at mimicking real connection that even the most intelligent people can't tell the difference until it's too late. Brian Anderson survived. He lost money, dignity, peace of mind, and the ability to trust. But he survived. And in surviving, he became something the scammers never anticipated. A voice that refuses to be silenced by shame. A warning they can't delete. And a reminder that victims are never the villains in these stories. The real villains are the ones who've industrialized human loneliness and turned suffering into profit margins. Write in the comments, have you or someone you know been targeted by romance or sextortion scams? Share your story. Break the silence. Because that silence is the only thing keeping this industry profitable. And your voice might be what saves the next person from making the payments Brian made, from feeling the shame he felt, from standing where he stood, staring at a phone screen, wondering if the price of connection is always this catastrophically high. I met Brian Anderson on a rooftop pool in Bangkok 3 years ago, during what should have been his celebration of freedom. Instead, I watched a 53-year-old man stare at his phone with the hollow eyes of someone who'd seen his entire life collapse in a 7